My son was in the ICU, barely breathing, held together by machines and prayers. But when my phone rang, my mother didn't ask if he was alive. She asked what time I'd arrive to help decorate for Sasha's birthday. That's when I realized I was never really part of that family. My name is Emma Roberts. I'm 34 years old, a graphic designer at a small media nonprofit in Portland, Oregon. And for the past 13 years, my life has revolved around one person, my son, Aiden. He has his father's stubborn chin and my eyes when he was a baby. I used to sing to him at night, pressing my cheek to his tiny head and whispering stories I made up on the spot. Ethan, my husband, would listen from the hallway, shaking his head and smiling like he couldn't believe we'd created something that perfect. That was before the fire that took him away, before I had to learn how to be two parents in one body, before I had to balance work deadlines with parent-teacher meetings and insurance claims and frozen chicken nuggets on nights I was too tired to cook. But somehow, we made it work. Our world was small, but it was enough. Ethan was a firefighter, proud and quiet and maddeningly brave. He didn't hesitate when the call came in about the apartment blaze on Hawthorne Street. He went in when others held back. He saved 2 children. He didn't come out. Aiden was 8. I remember telling him in the kitchen, his cereal half-eaten, his legs swinging from the chair. He asked me if Daddy would still be able to help with his science fair volcano. I told him no. That night, I held him like I'd never let go. Since then, it's just been the 2 of us. I've never tried to replace Ethan. I never dated again. My focus was survival, then stability, then slowly, something like joy. Aiden was thriving. He played cello, made robots from scratch, and once won a regional science competition with a project on renewable energy that I didn't even fully understand. I never told him how scared I'd been when I found out he wanted to ride his bike to school alone. But I let him go, waving from the porch like a normal mom, not the anxious widow who still triple-checked the locks at night. The Saturday started the way good Saturdays do. Light rain outside, pancakes in the pan. Aiden hunched over the kitchen table watching coding tutorials on his laptop. I had a freelance pitch due Monday, but I let it sit. The house smelled like syrup and coffee and everything ordinary. Around 11, Aiden asked if he could ride downtown with Max and Devin, his 2 best friends, to visit a pop-up robotics demo at the Science Museum. He had his helmet, his phone, and his signature preteen eye roll. I said yes. I watched him ride away, raincoat flapping behind him, and I remember thinking he looked so tall all of a sudden. The call came at 11:42 a.m., unknown number. The woman's voice was calm, practiced, the kind you only get after years of working emergency dispatch. There had been an accident. Aiden was struck by a car that swerved into the bike lane. He was unconscious. They were transporting him to Legacy Emmanuel's trauma unit. I remember standing up too fast, hitting my knee on the table. The next hours passed in pieces. The car ride, the waiting room, the social worker with the clipboard, the nurse who said, "We're doing everything we can." I signed forms without reading them. I answered questions like someone else was speaking for me. By the time I reached the pediatric ICU, Aiden was already in surgery, skull fracture, internal bleeding, a broken clavicle. The neurosurgeon explained the swelling, the induced coma, the timeline they couldn't promise. I nodded, gripping the edge of the counter like it could anchor me. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. At some point, I texted my dad. I didn't text my mother. Sylvia had a habit of showing up for moments she could control and disappearing from the ones that made her uncomfortable. When Ethan died, she brought over real estate listings and said we should move back in with her and my father because no single mother should raise a child alone. She said it with a smile, but what she meant was, now you'll finally let me run your life. When I refused. She started bringing over expensive toys for Aiden and asking, in front of him, if I was feeding him properly. She never hit me, never screamed, never cursed. But she could silence a room with a glance and make you feel like an ungrateful failure with just a sigh. At 6:10 p.m., while I sat by Aiden's hospital bed, watching machines breathe for him, my phone rang again. It was Sylvia. I hadn't heard from her all day. I answered, thinking maybe she was finally calling to ask how her grandson was doing. I was wrong. Her voice was crisp, unaffected. Emma, I need you to be at the house by noon tomorrow. We're finalizing the guest list for your grandparents' anniversary dinner. I'll need help with place cards and gift bags. I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at my son's bandaged head and then at the screen, wondering if this was a joke. Mom, I said slowly, Aiden is in intensive care. She clicked her tongue, annoyed. And the doctors are handling that. There's nothing for you to do. But I need support tomorrow. Everyone will be there. Rachel is flying in from Chicago. I could feel something cracking inside me. A soundless, invisible break. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. My hand clenched around the phone. That was the moment I realized how far she was willing to go to protect her illusion of perfection, even if it meant stepping over the broken body of her own grandson. That was the moment I remembered why I stopped asking her for help years ago. That was the moment this story truly began. I don't remember much of what I said to her on that call, only the sensation of my fingers going numb as she spoke. I think I said something like, Mom, I can't leave Aiden's side right now. She sighed in that specific way of hers. The sound she made when someone at church brought store-bought pie instead of baking from scratch. Emma, you always overreact. He's in the best hospital in the city, surrounded by professionals. You standing around in a hoodie won't change a thing. But what will be noticed is your absence tomorrow. People are expecting you. She said it like she was talking about a brunch, not a boy in a coma. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just stared at the reflection of my face in the window overlooking the hospital's rooftop, wondering how a woman could sound so clean and composed while my child's life was unraveling 4 feet away. I told her no. She didn't take it well. I stayed awake that night, curled in the vinyl recliner beside Aiden's bed, listening to the rhythm of his machines. The ICU was dim and hushed except for the occasional beep or rustle of nurses moving softly between rooms. Aiden's head was wrapped in gauze, his face pale and still. They had shaved a strip of his hair for the procedure, leaving him looking both older and unbearably small at once. I held his hand even though he didn't squeeze back. I talked to him about everything I could think of, like the smell of the wood shop he loved at school, the green ribbon he won for last year's engineering fair, the squirrel that once broke into our patio and stole a muffin. I don't know if he heard. I needed to believe he did. Sometime around 3 a.m., Sophie, the night nurse, brought me a cup of coffee and quietly slid a chair beside mine. She didn't say much, just sat for a few minutes and looked at Aiden the way only someone who's done this job for years can. After a while, she said, the ones who talk through it, they tend to wake up stronger. It's like they're tethered by sound. I nodded, unable to answer, afraid that any words would splinter whatever calm I had left. The next morning, around 9, my phone buzzed again. I hesitated before checking it, already knowing it was a group text. from my sister Rachel, addressed to me, my mother, and a few extended relatives. Reminder lunch today at 12, then family photos at 2. Grandma really wants everyone in matching neutrals for the picture. Please don't wear black. It's not a funeral. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I laughed, just once, short and bitter, because what else could I do? My sister didn't know, or didn't care, that I hadn't left the hospital in 40 hours, that I had slept sitting upright, eaten nothing but vending machine crackers, and barely remembered the smell of outside air. I didn't reply. Instead, I called my father. He answered on the third ring, his voice tight, like he already knew something was wrong. When I told him Aiden's condition, he whispered, "Jesus," then quieter. "Why didn't anyone tell me I didn't answer that?" He paused, then said, "Do you need me there?" I said, "Only if you want to be." He said he'd come right away. He arrived 2 hours later, carrying a paper bag of takeout and a change of clothes for me. He didn't ask permission before hugging me, didn't lecture or apologize. He just said, "You look like hell," and handed me a sandwich. I cried for the first time since the accident, right there in the hallway. After a while, he said, "Your mom knows you're here. She told everyone you were feeling overwhelmed and needed rest." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "She threatened to cut us off yesterday. Said if I didn't show up, the family trust in Aiden's education fund would be reconsidered." My dad exhaled sharply. That wasn't hers to weaponize. He muttered. I looked at him, searching for the same kind of resolve in his face that I'd just found in mine. I didn't see it. He stayed for a few hours, then said he had to get back to help manage expectations at the event. I didn't ask him to explain. After he left, I sat by Aiden again, his little hand still cool in mine, and I whispered something I hadn't said aloud since the day Ethan died. I won't let them use you to control me. At noon, while my mother was probably arranging seating charts and Rachel was curling her hair for the camera, a nurse tapped my shoulder. Dr. Shaw had arrived with the latest scan results. I followed him to the consultation room, my heart pounding like it always did in those moments between news and impact. The swelling in Aiden's brain had stabilized. They would begin tapering the sedation slowly. If his body responded well, he might begin to show signs of consciousness within the next 24 hours. I thanked him, my voice a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might unravel the progress. Then I returned to my seat, brushed Aiden's hair back with shaking fingers, and whispered into his ear that we were getting closer, that he wasn't alone, that I wasn't going anywhere. By evening, my phone was lighting up again. This time it was Rachel's husband, Greg. His message read, "Your mom is furious. She says you've embarrassed her in front of everyone. But happy anniversary to Grandma and Grandpa." I guess. I turned off my phone. In that moment, I chose silence over war. I chose presence over performance. I chose my son. That night, I barely moved from Aiden's side. The doctor's cautious optimism about his sedation tapering gave me something to hold on to, something I hadn't allowed myself to hope for in days. I watched his chest rise and fall in sync with the ventilator and whispered to him softly between nurse visits. I told him about the rain tapping the window, about his friends at school who had probably already sent messages, and about the robot kit waiting for him at home, somewhere around midnight. I closed my eyes for the first time in almost 2 days, not because I felt safe, but because exhaustion had finally won. At 6:03 a.m., I woke up to my phone buzzing. I had forgotten to turn it off. My mother's name filled the screen. I stared at it, heart pounding, then answered. Her voice was icy and rehearsed. Emma, your behavior yesterday was unacceptable. You humiliated this family in front of everyone. I stayed silent, pressing my hand against my temple, trying to stay grounded. You know how much we've done for you and Aiden. The fund, the car when yours broke down, the private tutoring you could never afford. She paused, letting that list settle like ash over the silence. Then she added, if you continue down this path, we'll have to reassess what support looks like going forward. It's not. That word, accountability, made me laugh quietly. Not the kind of laugh that signals joy, but the sharp, tired sound that comes when you've run out of disbelief, I said. You're threatening to take away Aiden's future because I wouldn't show up for a party. Her tone sharpened. It's not about the party. It's about respect. It's about family. You don't get to isolate yourself and still expect generosity. I looked at my son, pale and still, his wrist wrapped in sensors, and I realized something simple and devastating. She didn't see this situation as a crisis. She saw it as a choice I had made to embarrass her. She saw my presence in this hospital room not as love, but as defiance. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I said, thank you for clarifying. Then I ended the call. I deleted her number. I turned the phone off and set it face down. For the next few hours, I focused on learning every line on Aiden's face. I studied the edges of the bruising, the color returning slowly to his fingers, the slight flutter in his eyelids when a nurse adjusted his IV. I wrote down everything the doctors said in a spiral notebook Claire had dropped off the night before. I didn't cry. I didn't speak unless it was to Aiden or his nurses. I didn't think about what Sylvia might do next. But the universe has a way of testing resolve. Around noon, Claire arrived again with coffee and a change of clothes. She didn't say anything at first, just handed me a warm bagel and sat beside me. Then, gently, she said, so, I got a call. I turned to her. Your mom reached out to the office line, said she was concerned about your emotional fitness and wanted to know if we could arrange a leave of absence for you. Said she was worried about the effect this was all having on your performance. I felt the blood drain from my face. Claire saw it and added quickly, I shut it down, told her she had no authority to speak on your behalf, and reminded her our HR policy doesn't include gossip. I should have been surprised, but I wasn't. This was how Sylvia operated. If direct pressure didn't work, she'd work the angles, undermine, isolate, question credibility. I remembered being 16 and having my mother call the school counselor after I skipped a math test. She told them I was having behavioral issues and needed structure. That conversation led to weekly check-ins and the cancellation of my after-school photography class. I hadn't thought of that moment in years, but now it landed with stunning clarity. This wasn't new. This was the same pattern, played on a louder stage. Claire leaned in and said quietly, you're doing the right thing. Don't let her reframe it. I nodded, but her words didn't erase the unease curling at the edges of my chest. That afternoon, I stepped outside for the first time since the accident. The hospital courtyard was quiet, damp from morning drizzle. I sat on a bench and let the wind hit my face. I needed to think clearly. If Sylvia made good on her threats, Aiden's education fund would vanish. The modest college savings Ethan and I had started when he was 2 wouldn't cover much. I could apply for scholarships, take on more freelance work, but it would be tight. I knew it. Still, I couldn't go back. I couldn't pretend this was just a misunderstanding. I couldn't play nice just to keep the money. I looked up at the hospital windows and whispered to myself, "This is the cost of freedom, and I'll pay it." That evening, the sedation was reduced again. Dr. Shaw came by during his rounds, reviewed Aiden's latest scans, and confirmed what Sophie had quietly suspected. The brain swelling had decreased steadily, and for the first time, they were seeing slight pupil response. It was too early to call it progress, but it wasn't regression either. I clung to that. In a world that had narrowed down to vitals, reflexes, and the hum of machines, even a faint flicker felt monumental. Sophie stayed a little longer after her shift, talking me through the monitors and pointing out tiny signs that could mean recovery. I nodded along, committing every number, every abbreviation to memory like it was sacred code. I didn't dare ask when Aiden might open his eyes. I just stayed present. Later that night, as I sat beside his bed, reading aloud from one of his favorite science fiction novels, the hallway lights flickered with movement. I looked up and saw my father through the glass, holding a small white gift bag and looking sheepish. I opened the door halfway, unsure how much of him I could handle. He handed me the bag without a word. Inside was a pack of Aiden's favorite mechanical pencils and a note in my dad's shaky handwriting that read, "Tell him Grandpa stopped by." I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. He didn't try to come in. He didn't ask for forgiveness. But he did say one thing before leaving. "Your mother thinks you've lost perspective, but I've never seen you more clear." I sat with that sentence for hours, turning it over like a stone in my palm. He wasn't defending her anymore, but he wasn't confronting her either. He was always in the middle. He had been for decades, quiet, compliant, tired. He saw everything but said very little. I used to resent him for that. Now I just pitied the years he'd spent learning to disappear within his own marriage. The next morning, Aiden stirred for the first time. His hand moved slightly against mine, not enough to call deliberate, but enough to steal my breath. Sophie noticed it too, and nodded at me like she'd been expecting it. Dr. Shaw ordered more neuro exams and minimal stimulation while they monitored the effects. The sedation was reduced further that afternoon, and though Aiden didn't open his eyes, his vitals stayed stable. I didn't allow myself to cry. I just sat straighter, held his hand tighter, and kept talking. Around 3 p.m., my phone buzzed again. I had turned it back on to receive updates from the hospital, hoping the worst of the outside noise had passed. This time, it was Rachel. Her message was short, clipped, and perfectly polished. "Mom says you've made your decision. Just know it doesn't go unnoticed who chooses family and who doesn't. Hope Aiden's condition improves." I didn't respond. There was no point. I could see now that their version of family came with fine print and clauses. They loved best when it could be witnessed, when it could be praised, and when it could be leveraged. By early evening, Claire returned to relieve me for a quick meal. She didn't ask how I was. She just sat next to me, picked up where I left off in the novel, and read to Aiden while I walked to the cafeteria. I ate slowly, the food dull but grounding, when I returned. Sophie told me she'd noticed something new. Aiden had twitched in response to light during a reflex test. Not a full blink, but a measurable reaction. My chest filled with something I hadn't felt in days. Not hope, not yet, but direction. Like we were no longer standing still. At 9:20 p.m., I stepped outside again to call Ethan's parents. They lived in northern Idaho and had offered to come the moment they heard. I had told them to wait until we had more clarity, not wanting them to endure the waiting room vigil with no answers. I updated them on Aiden's condition, every word carefully measured so I wouldn't unravel in the middle of the parking lot. Ethan's mom, quiet for most of the call, finally said, "Emma, he's lucky to have you, and Ethan would be proud of how fiercely you've protected that boy." I thanked her and promised to call again in the morning. I stayed out in the chill for a few minutes longer, breathing slowly, letting that sentence echo in the space between fear and exhaustion. When I returned to the ICU, Sophie met me at the door. "He moved again," she said quietly, more deliberate this time. "We're getting closer." I stepped inside and looked at my son. His fingers twitched again, this time curling slightly toward his palm. I whispered to him, "You're doing great. Aiden, just keep fighting. I'm right here." And I was, right there, not in a ballroom smiling politely for family portraits, not serving canapes in a pastel dress pretending the world hadn't split in two, not holding back my grief to make others feel more comfortable. I was in the only place that mattered. The following morning, the ICU was quieter than usual. Aiden's room felt different somehow, as if the air had shifted slightly, allowing more hope to pass through. His vitals remained stable through the night, and by sunrise, the sedation had been tapered to its lowest setting. Sophie, with her steady hands and watchful eyes, gently reminded me that waking from a coma was not a single moment. It was a progression, often unpredictable and frustrating, but progress wasn't the absence of stillness. It was in the patterns, the subtle changes, the small returns. I nodded and took her words like armor. Just before 10 a.m., Aiden's hand twitched again, this time wrapping around one of my fingers for less than 2 seconds. It wasn't a full grasp, but it was real. I called the nurse, and within minutes, Dr. Shaw arrived with a team. They performed reflex tests, pupil checks, light response evaluations. Aiden flinched at the flashlight, his brow furrowed slightly when pressure was applied to his shoulder. Dr. Shaw turned to me and said carefully, "These are encouraging signs. He's emerging slowly, and that's exactly what we want right now." I didn't cry. I didn't cheer. I whispered thank you, then sat back down and resumed reading aloud from his book like it was the most normal thing in the world. Around noon, I stepped outside for fresh air while Claire sat with him. The courtyard was warmer than expected, sun pushing through clouds in quiet defiance of the forecast. I called Ethan's parents to share the update. His mother cried softly, then said, "Tell him Grandpa's saving a seat for him at the chessboard." His dad just said, "That's our boy." I had barely hung up when my phone buzzed again. This time it was Greg, my brother-in-law. The text read, "Vanessa's upset. Your mom's blood pressure spiked after your last conversation. Just so you're aware. The trust fund paperwork is being reviewed. That wasn't a warning. It was a tactic. The language was measured, deliberate, and entirely void of humanity." I stood still, phone in hand, and let the anger settle like dust. Then I walked back inside. When I returned to Aiden's room, Claire was holding his hand. He moved again. She said quietly, "You missed it by 30 seconds. I smiled, sat beside her, and told her about Greg's message. She didn't flinch. That's not family. That's theater. Her words landed with the finality of a gavel. I looked at her, grateful beyond words for the calm she carried with her, for the way she didn't ask me to explain what she already understood. She stayed for another hour, helping me adjust Aiden's blanket, filing insurance forms, and talking me through the financial options if the trust disappeared. There were grants, nonprofit funds, aid programs I hadn't considered. Claire had already started a list. Around 4 p.m., Dr. Shaw returned for a follow-up exam. Aiden opened his eyes. Just a flicker at first, then longer, still hazy but unmistakable. He didn't speak, couldn't with the ventilator still in place, but his eyes moved, slowly tracking the light. I leaned in, whispering, "Hey, buddy, it's Mom. You're safe. You're okay." He blinked again, slowly, deliberately. I squeezed his hand and felt the faintest response. Dr. Shaw nodded once. "Let's give him time. But this is what we've been waiting for." The room emptied slowly after that. I stayed. I didn't move. I just watched his breathing. The way his eyes fluttered closed, then opened again with increasing focus. He looked at me like he was trying to piece together the world around him. I didn't rush him. I didn't press for signs or answers. I just sat there, steady and silent, knowing this was the beginning of something sacred. That evening, while I was helping the nurse change Aiden's bedding, my phone rang again. I didn't check the screen. I simply powered it off. The silence felt like a decision, not avoidance. Afterward, as the machines continued their rhythm and Aiden drifted in and out of light sleep, I sat beside him, writing in my notebook. I didn't know what the next days would bring. Maybe another surgery, maybe a complication, maybe more days like this, quiet and slow and sacred. But I knew one thing with a certainty I hadn't felt in years. There was no amount of money, no inheritance, no illusion of belonging that could replace the value of being fully present for the person who needed me most. My son had reached for my hand when everything else was dark. That meant something. That meant everything. The morning Aiden's ventilator was removed, the ICU room felt strangely still. The doctor had warned that it might take a few hours before he tried speaking, that his throat would be raw, his strength limited, and confusion likely. But the moment I saw him open his eyes and track my movement, really track it with intention, I felt something inside me shift. Not everything would go back to how it was, but something had returned, something we both needed. I leaned in, adjusted his blanket, and whispered, "You're safe. We're okay." He blinked slowly, then mouthed something I couldn't quite read. The nurse beside us said gently, "Give it time. The muscles need to remember how to coordinate." I nodded. I had time. I would give him all of it. That afternoon, we were cleared for visitors for the first time since the accident. Claire stopped by briefly, bringing a sketch pad and a set of colored pencils Aiden liked. She sat at the foot of the bed, speaking softly, showing him a photo of the robot competition he missed. He smiled faintly. It was the first facial expression we'd seen since the accident. She squeezed his foot and said, "Next time, you're building the winning bot. I'll make the t-shirts." Aiden blinked, and I could see his gratitude, even if he couldn't speak it yet, before she left. She leaned close to me and said, "You're stronger than anyone I know. Don't let them pull you back into a place you already escaped from." I knew what she meant, and I didn't have to wait long to test it. Around 5:30 p.m., without warning or a message. My mother walked into the hospital room. Behind her was Rachel, holding a designer tote and looking like she'd walked straight out of a catalog. Sylvia didn't speak right away. She stood there, scanning the room like it offended her, before letting her eyes land on Aiden. "There he is," she said, voice high and bright like a Sunday church greeting. "You gave us quite a scare." I stepped between her and the bed instinctively, my body reacting faster than my mind. He's recovering, I said quietly. He needs calm. Rachel stepped forward, her tone rehearsed. We just wanted to check in. Mom was worried. I looked at both of them, waiting for something real to emerge. An apology, a question, anything human. But all I got was a gaze full of disappointment wrapped in faux concern. Sylvia smiled thinly, then lowered her voice. We should talk. Outside. I hesitated. Aiden looked at me, his eyes tired but alert. He nodded slowly, as if to say, Go ahead, I'll be here. I followed them into the hallway. Sylvia didn't waste time. You embarrassed me. You humiliated this family. You skipped your grandparents' anniversary, ignored calls, blocked everyone. And for what? To sit here and watch machines. I held her gaze. Rachel chimed in next. It was hard for everyone. Emma, you made it look like we didn't care. That's when I felt it. Not sadness, not shame, but clarity. I said, You didn't ask how he was. You didn't show up until the tubes were gone and the risk had passed. You cared about appearances, not people. Sylvia's face tightened. We care. Emma. But life doesn't stop just because something difficult happens. That's not how strong women behave. I smiled then, not because anything was funny, but because it was finally absurd enough to break through the fatigue. Strong women don't abandon their children in ICU to organize seating charts. Strong women don't manipulate with money and shame. Her voice dropped an octave. You're pushing away the only family you have left. I stepped closer. No, I'm protecting the only family that matters. Rachel looked away. Sylvia's jaw tensed. Then she said, Don't expect support going forward. The education fund is being reallocated. It's already in process. I didn't flinch. Then I guess it's good we learn now what strings were attached. You can keep the money. I'll keep my son. Her voice cracked. For the first time. Just slightly. You're being dramatic. I shook my head. No, I'm being done. I walked back into Aiden's room before either of them could say another word. He looked at me, eyes wide, and I could tell he'd heard at least part of the exchange. I sat beside him and said gently, I won't let anyone else make you feel like you're not enough, ever again. He blinked slowly, and this time, he mouthed clearly enough for me to read it. You stayed. I smiled, then kissed his forehead. Every minute. The next week was a blur of quiet victories and silent recalibrations. Aiden's voice returned slowly, gravelly at first, then steadier with each passing day. He said short sentences, asked for water, looked for familiar faces. The first time he whispered, Mom. I had to leave the room for a moment, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I didn't want him to see the tears forming in my eyes. I had promised him steadiness, and I intended to keep that promise. Dr. Shaw called his recovery measured but promising. There were still hurdles ahead, cognitive assessments to complete, mobility issues to address, and physical therapy to schedule, but for the first time since the accident, the unknown didn't feel paralyzing. It felt possible. Each morning, I brought a notebook with questions for the care team, notes on medications, and updates for Ethan's parents. I kept my focus tight, 1 hour at a time, 1 day at a time. I didn't think about the future beyond the next blood pressure reading or neuro check. That kind of discipline didn't come from perfection. It came from pain, from living through loss once before, and knowing exactly how fragile every improvement could be. On the 4th day, post-extubation, Aiden sat up on his own. It took him 12 minutes, 2 nurses, and a small mountain of grunts and effort, but he did it. He looked at me, exhausted but proud, and said, I want to go home. I smiled, smoothing the hair off his forehead. Soon, we're getting there, he nodded, already closing his eyes from the effort that night while he slept. I opened my email for the first time in days. There were dozens of unread messages, some from Claire's team about coverage for my design role, some from distant relatives sending generic wishes for a speedy recovery, one from a lawyer I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Trust disbursement status." I didn't open it. I already knew what it contained. My mother had followed through. The financial cord had been cut. For a few minutes, I stared at the screen, wondering whether I should feel panic or regret. But what I felt instead was something quieter, something clearer. I had made the right choice. The fact that it cost something only proved it had value. The next morning, while Aiden was in a therapy session, learning how to sit from a low bench, I started running the numbers. My nonprofit salary wouldn't cover private rehab, so I made a list. Grants, crowdfunding, local aid. My freelance photography gear was still stored in the hall closet, dusty but intact. I texted Claire and asked her to send me the client list I'd walked away from 2 years ago. She responded within 5 minutes. Already pulled it. Ready when you are. That afternoon, as Aiden played with a simple puzzle to test motor function, one of the hospital's social workers stopped by. She asked if I had support at home, if there was a care plan in place, and whether I had any financial concerns. I told her the truth. We're on our own, but I've done this before. We'll be okay. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Most people would have chosen the money." I didn't answer. I just reached for Aiden's water bottle and adjusted the incline of his bed. The work didn't scare me. The cost didn't scare me. The only thing that had ever scared me was losing the one person I loved without having fully shown up for him. 2 days later, we were cleared for discharge with outpatient care and a strict rehab schedule. Aiden was tired but excited. We rode home in silence, his hand resting lightly in mine. When we reached the apartment, I saw the small stack of mail on the floor. One letter from a bank confirming the termination of the trust account. Another from Sylvia's estate advisor with a note that read, "For your records." I placed them on the counter and turned my attention back to the boy standing in my doorway, bracing himself against the wall like it was both an obstacle and a homecoming. I didn't need reminders of what was lost. I had everything that still remained. That night, we ate soup and toast at the kitchen table. Aiden asked if he'd missed the science fair. I said yes. He nodded solemnly, then asked if we could build something anyway. Doesn't have to be for school, he added, just for us. I got up, went to the closet, and pulled out the unopened robotics kit Ethan had ordered last year. It had been sitting there since Christmas, waiting for the right time. I placed it on the table and said, "Then let's build." The first week home was harder than I expected. The apartment, once our small sanctuary, suddenly felt too quiet, too still. Every corner held memories I hadn't had time to process in the hospital. The coat rack still held Aiden's rain jacket from the morning of the accident. His school books were stacked neatly on the counter, untouched since that day. I left them there, not out of avoidance, but out of respect. We weren't picking up where we left off. We were starting something new. Aiden's mobility was limited. Physical therapy was scheduled 3 times a week at a nearby clinic, and we had daily exercises to do together at home. I helped him relearn how to navigate stairs, how to lift his legs into bed, how to bend and stretch without overexertion. He was patient, sometimes more than I deserved. On the 3rd day, after struggling through a balance drill, He dropped the foam ball we'd been using and said quietly, "I hate this." I sat on the floor beside him, crossed my legs, and said, "Me too." He didn't cry, and neither did I. We just sat in that shared exhaustion for a minute before picking the ball back up. During those early weeks, I worked nights after Aiden went to bed. Claire had sent over the photography client list, and I started emailing past contacts to let them know I was taking bookings again. The first job that came through was a small backyard wedding for a couple in their late 40s. Intimate, quiet, full of people who knew what love looked like after loss. It felt fitting. I shot it in soft afternoon light, my hands steadier than I expected. When the bride hugged me afterward and said, "You captured something real," I felt something settle in my chest. I was still good at this, and maybe that was enough to start over. I never replied to the lawyer's email about the trust. I didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. My mother didn't call. Rachel didn't text. My father, to his credit, sent a card a week after our discharge. It said, "Proud of you, always have been," even when I didn't say it. I folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer next to Aiden's medical records. I didn't know if I believed him, but I appreciated the attempt. On the first Saturday of spring, Aiden walked from the living room to the kitchen without assistance. No cane, no hand on the wall, just slow, focused steps across the wooden floor. I watched him from the sink, sponge in hand, and didn't say a word until he reached the table. "That's the furthest yet," I said quietly. He looked down at his feet like they belonged to someone else, then up at me. I didn't even think about it. He said, "I just moved." I nodded. That's how healing works sometimes, quietly, in the background, until one day you realize it's happening. That night, we stayed up late building the robot from the kit. It wasn't complicated, but Aiden insisted on reading every instruction out loud. He used his fingers slowly, pausing every few minutes to rest, but he never gave up. When it finally powered on and blinked to life, he grinned. It was the first full smile I'd seen in weeks. I snapped a photo before he could stop me, and we laughed when the flash startled the cat off the couch. Later, I uploaded the picture to a private folder titled Proof. We weren't fully out of the woods. His headaches still came every few days, and his focus sometimes drifted mid-conversation. But we had routine now, a sense of direction, and that was more than we'd had in a long time. One evening, while we were organizing his school assignments for part-time return, Aiden asked, "Are we still going to visit Grandpa and Grandma this summer?" I paused, unsure how much to share. I said, "We might do something different this year, somewhere new, just us." He nodded, thoughtful. They weren't around much, before or after, but I remember things they said. I looked at him gently. "What kind of things?" He hesitated, then said, "Grandma used to say we were lucky you even had a job, that it wasn't a real one." I felt something tighten in my chest. "Did that bother you?" He shrugged. "It confused me, because you were always working, always doing stuff. So I figured either she didn't understand, or she didn't want to." I didn't respond right away. I just looked at my son, this quiet, recovering version of the boy who used to race down sidewalks and build cities out of Lego bricks. Then I said, "Sometimes people try to shrink others to feel bigger, but we don't need to make space for that anymore." He smiled slightly. "Good, because I think your job's cool." I laughed, reached for the math workbook, and said, "Well then, let's get this homework out of the way. We've got a robot to upgrade." It took less than 6 weeks for everything to look completely different. Not perfect, not fixed, just different in the way only quiet, consistent effort can make possible. Aiden had returned to school part-time, going 3 days a week with a learning specialist support. His stamina wasn't what it used to be, but his spirit was. He was starting to tell jokes again, working on a new robot design with Claire's help, and reading out loud to the cat at night. The boy who once lay in silence under blinking ICU monitors was now asking questions about AI ethics and whether he could build a drone from scratch. As for me, I had taken on 5 new freelance clients, mostly nonprofits and small businesses. The money wasn't steady, but it was mine. I didn't have to ask permission to pick up Aiden from school or to say no to projects that didn't align with my values. I worked from home 3 days a week, shot photos on weekends, and built a modest buffer in savings that made every decision feel less desperate. We were far from wealthy, but we were safe, and more importantly, we were enough. One afternoon, as I was editing headshots for a local clinic's board members, I got an unexpected email. The subject line read, "Inquiry Family Legacy Fund Proposal." It was from a foundation based in Chicago that supported women-led community programs across the Midwest. Claire had referred them after I mentioned my long-standing idea to create accessible art workshops for kids in recovery. I had tucked the dream away for years, believing it was too fragile, too indulgent, too disconnected from survival. But now, in the quiet space after trauma, I realized it was the most honest thing I'd ever wanted. I pitched the program within 3 days, drawing from every design and youth advocacy project I'd ever worked on. I included Aiden's story, not as a sob tale, but as evidence of what rebuilding could look like when kids were met with patience instead of pity. 2 weeks later, they replied with approval for a starter grant. It wasn't a lot, but it was a start. More than anything, it was a yes to something I'd never had the courage to ask for. Around the same time, Rachel called. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that sounded forced, polite, and slightly rushed. She said our parents were wondering if we'd moved past the misunderstanding and if we wanted to reconnect before summer. I listened to the message 3 times before deleting it. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just a vague plea for comfort disguised as reconciliation. I didn't need it, and neither did Aiden. Instead, I took him on our first weekend trip since the accident. We rented a tiny cabin near Lake Michigan. Nothing fancy. We packed sandwiches, downloaded audiobooks, and spent the drive talking about stars and inventions and what kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. At night, we watched the sky through the roof window and talked about Ethan. Aiden asked if I still missed him. I said, every day. Then he asked, "Do you think he'd be proud of us?" I smiled and said, "He'd be proud that we're still building." The next morning, I checked my email again and saw a message from my dad. Short, to the point. "I saw the foundation picked up your idea. Congratulations. You always knew who you were, even when we didn't." I didn't reply, but I let the words settle in, not as closure, but as confirmation that walking away had not been selfish. It had been survival. A few days later, while walking home from therapy, Aiden said, "Mom, if I ever get famous for building robots, will you be my manager?" I laughed and said, "Only if I get a good title." He thought for a second. "You can be chief of recovery and snacks." It was ridiculous and perfect. I said, "Deal." And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next disaster or looking over my shoulder for someone's judgment. I just felt home. The week Aiden's new project was selected for the district science fair, I received a second letter from my mother. The envelope was hand-addressed. No lawyer's stamp, no official language, just her handwriting, looping and neat, like it had always been when she used to write birthday cards before everything unraveled. Inside. She said she hoped I was doing well. She said she missed Aiden and wanted to make things right. There were no apologies, no recognition of the harm, no mention of the hospital, or the fact that during the worst week of our lives, she had been choosing cake colors and tablecloths, just a simple request to meet for lunch, or coffee, if that's easier. I stared at the note for a while, then I folded it gently, put it in the drawer where I keep expired coupons and warranties I no longer need. It didn't make me angry. It just didn't mean anything anymore. By then, the house was no longer filled with tension. Aiden had started inviting friends over again. Claire came by most Sundays, bringing muffins and updates from her own quiet rebellion. She had left her job at the Family Foundation and joined a nonprofit focused on equitable housing. She seemed lighter, braver. She didn't talk much about our parents anymore, and I didn't ask. We both understood that not every wound demands a conversation. Some just need time and clean air to close. That month, I launched the first pilot session of the program I'd designed. A group of 12 kids gathered in the basement of a community arts center on the west side of town. Some were survivors of illness. Others had lost parents. And a few were just kids who needed a space that didn't ask them to be cheerful all the time. We didn't do anything revolutionary. We painted. We told stories. We made collages about what safety looked like. And slowly, I saw the same spark return to their eyes that I had watched flicker in Aiden's months before. Not hope exactly, something steadier, the decision to stay present. Aiden wanted to help with the next session. He didn't want to talk about what happened, but he wanted to build something, a wooden shadow box, where each kid could put a memory, or a drawing, or a photo. He said he wanted it to feel like a museum of surviving. I nodded and told him it was perfect. We spent a weekend sanding the wood together, not saying much, just letting the silence be comfortable. There was nothing left to explain. We were past survival mode. We were crafting something that would outlast the chaos. On the anniversary of the accident, I woke up early and baked the same kind of bread Ethan used to love. Aiden came into the kitchen quietly, sat down, and said, "I don't want today to be sad." I told him it didn't have to be, that remembering someone isn't the same as mourning them, that it could also mean living better, deeper, because of them. He nodded, thoughtful, and said he wanted to plant something. We went to the nursery, picked out a stubborn little fig tree, and planted it in the corner of the yard we'd just cleared. The soil wasn't perfect, but we made it work. Later that night, I checked my email and saw a message from an old colleague at my former agency. They had heard about the grant, seen the pilot program featured in a local blog, and wanted to reconnect. She said the team missed me, that maybe there was space for collaboration. I didn't feel bitterness, just clarity. I thanked her, told her I was open to talking, but only if the conversation started with equal ground. No titles, no memory loss about what had happened. She wrote back within hours. Agreed. You deserved better. Let's start fresh. I didn't know if anything would come of it, but I knew I no longer needed validation, just integrity. The last piece I added to our proof folder was a picture Claire had taken without me knowing. I was sitting with Aiden on the front steps, our hands full of dirt from the tree planting. We weren't posing, we weren't performing, just resting, together. I printed it, framed it, and placed it in the entryway, not for guests, for us. People think revenge has to be loud, that justice must arrive in a dramatic reveal, but sometimes it's just the soft sound of a locked door that doesn't reopen, or the silence of a phone that never rings again, or the steady heartbeat of a life rebuilt, brick by careful brick, without the people who said they loved you, but only when you stayed small. We didn't win by proving them wrong. We won by becoming whole without needing them to watch.